And so you famously have said multiple times, and even in this conversation, that the customer doesn't really care about the specs
Yes.
anymore. It was probably fine, but since we've gotten accustomed to certain experiences in our personal life, whether it's Instacart, Uber, all these other things, Amazon, they just don't care about the specs. They just want it to work.
Yeah.
Explain to me how the customer has changed.
Yeah. So there's a book I read a long time ago just about like the technology wheel, if you will. And what happens is we get an iPhone and it's amazing and it's a luxury to have an iPhone. Well, that was more than 10 years ago. I don't even know when, what are we on, iPhone 15 now?
I was going to say, we're coming up on 20 years.
Yeah, exactly. So after you have this piece of technology, you start building your life around this technology, and then it becomes essentially a utility. That's what happens. And cloud has become a utility. Our phones have become a utility. Our networks have become a utility. And that's just the life cycle of technology. Once I use it, when we were building networks, 15 years ago or now, it was innovative and it was a nice to have. And so the customer was really operating on the wired network, and then the wireless network was an amenity. Those days are gone. The wireless network is running their point of sale, and the wireless network is running their company. And so if that network goes down, the entire business is down. And that's come true with our phones that are in our pockets. That's come true with all the networks that we're using, with our computers. If I lost my computer, what would I do?
Right.
The company, we'd be down.
Off today.
Exactly. I don't know what I would do all day. And so that's just the nature of technology.
And is that really what spurred then, how do we do as a service?
If a customer's mindset is, I just need to consume it as a utility, or I just want this solution to work, then that's where the utility-based model makes sense. And more, if you went into a small business that might have not even a lot of employees, they still need to have a network in place. And the consumption model in that environment is much best to consume it monthly. That's why when we buy internet to our buildings, we just pay a monthly fee for it. I think that same type scenario is going to apply to essentially everything inside buildings. Now, I'm not the one who thinks this. A lot of the industry geeks think this as well.
But it's been kind of a problem for a lot of VARs and MSPs to actually do it.
Yeah. So if you listen to the industry geeks, and I'm an industry geek and I listen to the industry geeks, they say that 75% of infrastructure that goes into buildings like this one are going to be consumed in some sort of as a service model. They've been saying this for several years. Now, 75% of infrastructure in buildings is not currently consumed that way. And their question is, well, why is it not? Well, because the technology companies, which is where almost 75%, it's somewhere between 70 and 75% of all the technology is sold into businesses, don't have the capability to deliver it effectively as a service. And so if you solve that problem, I do believe that, and that was our experience when we had a service provider, that if you offer it to a customer, they will usually choose the subscription-based model.
You talk about flipping the subscription model.
Yeah.
Right? What do you mean by that? In terms of flipping it like a car dealership? Like, can you go into that in terms of what that means? Because I think you've said that's really what could be game changing if people would.
Well, yeah. So I mean, just conceptually, 85% of cars and homes are, I don't know the exact statistic, are essentially financed. And so when you go into a car dealership or you're going to buy your house, you're usually looking at, how much house can I afford? And you don't mean how much can I pay cash for? You mean, what am I paying monthly for, right? I need to put some down, whatever. So just conceptually, if we were selling essentially as a service, the price tag and the value or essentially that the customer could receive would be much higher. So if I had to pay cash for my car versus financing, I'm going to buy less car. Same thing is true about technology. Now, what a lot of people don't understand is that a lot of the customers are already financing technology and buying it essentially that way. They're just doing it through a commercial line or something like that. And what we're advocating is when you're putting infrastructure in a building, and the reason that AWS hasn't solved this problem yet is because if you do the infrastructure in a building, somebody has to finance that. Somebody has to buy it and then finance that. That's very complicated. What that means is that technology finance needs to be embedded into the essentially sales stack, if you will, of the VAR and the MSP, so they can easily flip between subscription-based models and charging the customer up front, and just gives them that flexibility to essentially sell everything bundled together and as a service. And what we're saying is if you can bundle those things together, in the car dealership kind of example, well, you can include a service contract, you can include, updates to it, you can include free oil changes if you're not driving an electric car or whatever. And so if you put that into the MSP and VAR, it unlocks all sorts of other revenue opportunity. And the other thing I want to point out too, from our own experience is we could sell a lot more, and you're selling in a blended margin type scenario where you're not competing necessarily for, a hardware margin or a service margin. It's just blended together. And so the customer doesn't have as much kind of control, if you will, over the transaction because, hey, it's going to be $10,000 a month. And that's really, I think, where the industry is headed, and the average of our MSP needs to get to.
And about when did Secure Edge start selling network as a service?
We started selling it around 2016 is when we started going in to customers. And we realized very quickly that we were going to run out of money if we kept going in that model because
you were funding it.
Because we were self-funding.
Okay.
So we were going to customers, and customers were like, yeah, we love the subscription model. We're like, well, we're going to get that money from.
Right.
So we weren't big enough to fund a lot of the larger transactions. So I could go in and fund a small transaction, but I could see very quickly that the more successful we were, if we were going to be our own bank, the more capital I needed to raise for the bank.
Also extremely risky if a customer decides to...
Exactly. That's the other part of it is what if a customer can't pay their bill? What are we going to do? And so there was that whole there's a trend where you go into an MSP of R and they want to be their own bank. Now there's some scenarios where that makes sense if they're sitting on a lot of cash and they want to do that. But there's actually a lot of logistics that's involved in being your own bank that you have to be aware of. The first thing is, if your team is really successful, you're going to have to raise more capital. That's just the reality. So, you have to think about how much can I scale before I have to raise money. And do you want to go raise money just to buy technology and put it in buildings? Do you want to handle the credit risk? If your customer fails, that's a little bit intimidating, on some of these larger transactions. And then there's a lot of other really details that are super important. How do you handle taxation and things like that? And if you start putting out a lot of equipment at customers' locations, have personal property tax and things like that have to be filed on these locations. There's so much logistics that's involved. And so what we decided to do is instead of trying to become the own bank, the really big unlock for us was getting linked up with a technology finance program. And once we were able to connect with Wells Fargo and some of these other technology finance programs, that really enabled us to figure out how to package these things without carrying all that liability and the tax burden and things like that.
Right. And customers were very receptive when you pitched it to them.
Yeah. So we had this debate internally. Right? You work here. We like to debate.
Sure.
And the debate internally was if we went into companies that are traditional, and I'm talking about insurance companies and companies that maybe had a lot of capital, would they even consider a consumption model when we were pitching it to them? They're used to buying $1 million in infrastructure and then paying $150,000 to $200,000 a year to maintain that infrastructure. If we go in and pitch them, completely subscription-based model, would they even entertain it? And we were pleasantly surprised that they were not only open to it, but that they actually wanted to do that. And that really shocked me in a couple of the deals that we were able to process, right, where we were presenting this essentially as a service option. And they would say, hey, we consume AWS on a utility-based model. We consume Microsoft on subscription, essentially being billed monthly for our Microsoft licenses. Why wouldn't we consume a network or communication system? Why would we do that essentially as a service? And so it was very, very receptive. And matter of fact, when we led with the subscription model, what we found is that we ended up selling some sort of subscription component 80% of the time. So even if we went in with, hey, it's network as a service, and they were like, hey, we have capital, we want to buy some of that, they ended up with the managed services contract. And so it ended up growing our services revenue dramatically when we started leading with the as a service model.